A central part in what we all do in operations is not just knowing how much to sell it for, because pricing, as elusive as it is still a bit dicey because you really don't know the differences between what is going to end up being your pocket price versus what is going to be your established retail sales price or your general selling price. And your pocket price is typically lower than your recommended pricing. So given that we don't really have too much leverage in terms of exactly how well we can price something, what we do have better control over is how we can manage costs. So there are two pieces of the puzzle. You have your price and you have your costs. You can keep the price the same and you can bring the costs down, which basically means that your margin starts improving. And that itself is called the gross margin. And that gross margin itself is a phenomenally important piece of the puzzle, because the gross margin is what is nothing but revenue minus costs of goods sold. So your gross margin is nothing but revenue minus costs of goods sold. So if you are to look at your gross margin, the two ways of playing with it. One is you can play with how much you want to charge for it. But oftentimes that is tricky, as we were mentioning. It's dicey, mainly because a lot of companies are faced with this problem in terms of who else is giving a discount? Who are the other competitors in the market? Do we have currency headwinds against us? And as you're even studying money and markets, you must be hearing loads and loads of times about the term called currency headwinds. Any idea, any takers in terms of quickly explaining what a currency headwind is? I think your microphones should be on. At least you have the privilege of turning it on if you fancy, or you could just chat and let us know. Any idea what a currency headwind is? So I'm going to type it. What's a currency headwind, and how does it impact pricing and costing? Hetal, yes, I am sharing a slide. Can't you see? Can you see it? Yes, it does. So I'm going to change it to the next to show you that's all right. That's mainly because I was just prepping ourselves to get into the next set once we understand this whole idea of why it's important for us to do cost control. Very good, Angela. So it does make growth more difficult, but why does it make growth why does it impede growth? Any idea why it impedes growth, or why is it very difficult to, especially you'll see. Very good. And oftentimes it's the relative value of the currency exchange that creates the problem. For example, tomorrow, if we are dealing one, right, Larry, so yes, price wars do hurt margins, but with currency headwinds, what happens is, today, suppose we're dealing with China, and the Chinese renminbi to the US dollar is marked at 1:6. So for every dollar you spend, you're getting 6 Chinese renminbis. And that's fine and dandy, which means that, you're going to get 6 times more in that currency. Now suppose tomorrow the Chinese renminbi gets revalued and suddenly Chinese renminbi is $1 is equal to 4 Chinese renminbi, or $1 is equal to 5 Chinese renminbi. Is that a good thing for the United States, or is it a bad thing for the US? Anybody? Why is it bad, Tammy? You're spot on, as always. But why is it bad? And that's exactly it. Now, your dollar is buying less. Now, suppose you have an operational establishment in China where you're now saying that, you know what, our expense set was to sort of have 6 million RMB in place for every single period to pay the employees. Now, 6 million RMB would have otherwise been $1 million per period to pay the employees. Now, suddenly, their headwinds have changed it, and now the currency rate is 1:5. So instead of paying $1 million that's converted into 6 million RMB, you still have to pay them $6 million. So how much will you now have to pay? You now have to pay them $1.2 million, right? So because 1.2 times 5, it's now 1:5. 1.2 times 5 is equal to 6. So guess what's happened? You've suddenly increased your expenses or your cost basis by another 20%, just because of a move from 6 to 5, which is, so from move from 6 to 5 is somewhat around 1.6, which is 16%. So the currency headwind of 16% devaluing of the dollar suddenly increases your costs by more, which increases your cost by about 20%. So 6 turns into 5, which is a drop in 16%, or a drop of 16%. Yet your expenses move up by from 1 million to 1.2 million, which is an increase in 20%, because every time you're going up, percentages are always higher than when percentages calculated going down. Does that make sense, guys? Yes? Everybody, quick hand. If you want to do a quick show of hands, you can do that. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Fantastic, fantastic. Lovely, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, brilliant. So, keep in mind that when we're even talking money and markets, when we're always looking at operational headwinds, because when we're talking about currency, I think I mentioned that last time when we were in class, that it's weird, but the biggest cash flow marker in any company is typically cash flow from operations, because cash flow from financing and cash flow from investing are oftentimes more sort of victims of other political, social forces and so forth, while in this case, therefore, it becomes sort of imperative upon the incumbent or this incumbent firm to make sure that your cost control is in order. So that's another reason why China doesn't want to make sure that its currency is floating, because the minute China floats its currency is actually going to appear to be stronger than it actually is. So China wants to make sure that its currency appears weaker, so that the US is likely to keep on moving its operations offshore. Because the minute the Chinese currency gets stronger, suddenly think of it, if Chinese renminbi fell from 6 to 5, you'd have less of a propensity and say that, wait, 20% increase in cost, which basically means it's going to be a big drop in my gross margin. And if it's a big drop in your gross margin, you might not actually want to end up doing it. So this goes into what we were talking about last time, which is as you're preparing or as you're even understanding break even points, understand that what you're learning are not siloed bits of learning. Money and markets is not really different from operations. It's how money and markets fit into the operational context. It's exactly how money and markets will drive supply chain prices, is how it's going to drive spot prices versus future prices. And those are the pieces of the puzzle that will actually allow you to make a better decision in terms of. So let's put it in this way. So suppose you are an inventory specialist, or you're running the supply chain, or you're doing large scale volume procurement across 5 different countries in the world. You could just look at money and markets and try and figure out, all right, I want to see how the currency futures are moving, which basically means I want to see if tomorrow there's a downward pressure. So would anybody like to just name me a country, and that's way let's apply it to a certain country, or name me a couple of countries. Thank you, Brazil. Sorry? Thank you, Joyce, for Brazil, and one more country, please. So suppose you're dealing with Brazil and India. So Brazil, um, what's Brazil's currency? Touche. True. But what is actually Brazil's currency? It used to be the old Spanish currency. Is it peso? So assume it's peso and a rupee. Oh, real. Thank you very much. It's a Brazilian real. Thank you. Um, Real and a rupee. So, as you're dealing with both these countries, so assume you've got production operations, or you're planning to do volume purchase out of Brazil and out of India, and you suddenly say that, all right, you look into your currency futures market. So you can look at currency futures. You can just type on Google currency futures. It'll show you currency futures for every single thing. So suppose real has an upward pressure, which means it's likely to get upvalued, and rupee has a downward pressure. And so, thank you very much, Angela. So, real has an upward pressure and the rupee has a downward pressure. So, if I were to ask you, as an operations manager, you're trying to purchase from both these countries. You want to purchase, suppose, $5 million worth of goods from each of these countries. How would you use money and capital markets information to actually make a proper decision? So what you would do in this case, you'd know that, all right, real has an upward pressure going on, which means the price of the real is suddenly going to be more expensive in the future, which basically means I'd be able to afford less with the same dollar, which means with Brazil, you would do a spot purchase. You do a spot purchase because you know that tomorrow it's going to get more expensive. So you're going to do a spot trade or a spot purchase. It's called a spot trade or a spot purchase. With India, you would do a futures purchase, which could be as simple as saying that all I want to do is I'm going to I'm going to place the order from India possibly 2 weeks later, not right now, because the rupee is going to get weaker, which means I'd be able to spend the same money and get a better deal, or spend less money for exactly the same amount of goods and services. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is to use the spot and futures and basically do a hedge and say that, all right, I'm going to hedge against the real, or I'm going to hedge for the rupee, and you can run it that way. Now, does that make sense? So just to give you an example of how these things play themselves out in just about, how interconnected we are across the whole gamut and the myriad of activities that we end up doing. Makes sense, guys? Either show of hand or a quick yes or whatever it is. Fantastic. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Hital. Angela, makes sense? Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Everybody makes sense. Jackie, madam, makes sense. Larry, everybody? Fantastic. Cool. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, keep these. Let's put these two things in play. So one thing they say is, given the fact that there are all these currency headwinds and we can choose one country over the other, if you want to purchase corn from, I don't know, India versus Brazil, you could say, you know what, the Indian currency is getting weaker, so I'm going to purchase it from them, versus I'm not going to purchase anything from Brazil. So suddenly, if you are dealing with commodities, the problem is there are too many sellers where buyers have too many options. But you don't want your buyers or your clients to have too many options. You're always trying to reduce their switching costs. So your key is, I'm going to subtly use my operations to create a product at a cost that is going to involve a certain quality that nobody else can create. And secondly, I'm going to maintain my costs in such a way so that I can actually run my margin pressures downwards, because I'd be able to compete in just about any market, but by adding that quality to it, it'll change the whole gig altogether. And this is where we get back to Deeming and Duran, where I think this is exactly where we were, and we were talking about the fact that when Deeming and Duran, so let me see if I can choose a colored marker, and so Deeming and Duran, both of them statisticians, they talked about these following things. Everyone ought to be responsible for quality, and this is we covered this, so I'll just use this as a quick recap. Not just the inspectors. So a good company is likely to have quality control as a culture, not as a function, if that makes sense. So a good company should always have quality control as a culture rather than a function. The second thing is, the product should be made right the very first time to avoid rework. And we talked about, I think last time we were there, the very famous bullwhip effect, that things tend to accentuate themselves over time, which basically means a single error. Suppose this is time, and this is error cost, or costs of fixing the error. So it's going to look like this over time. So as time passes, if you were to correct it here, you'd only have this much cost. If you correct it here, you'll have this much cost. If you correct it here, you'll have this much cost. So look at how your cost changes if you, instead of off, you're absolutely right. So true, if you're, the thing is, Angela, you're absolutely right. You need to do your quality checks both upstream and downstream, but the better quality upstream means less quality issues downstream. And think you know, saying true, TQM and Deming model, the PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act is it's very, and when you talk about the cost of opportunities, so no, would you be kind enough to explain to all of us what opportunity costs are, because that is a phenomenally well said point. So what exactly is an opportunity cost? True. So it is a problem, but think of it. An opportunity cost is nothing but, could you have used the money you're spending on one thing in some other place that would have given you a better rate of return? Just like, so let's go back to this really ugly looking graph that I've just drawn. So think of the costs here. This would have been the costs that you would have, you would have incurred in order to fix the problem. Now, if you were to fix it here, the amount of costs you have to incur is this much, which is the difference between those two costs would be this section, right? This whole section. Thing is, could you have used that money somewhere else? That you could use. And thank you, exactly. So, it is more of a cost, better use of the funds, because every single thing has a return on investment, and in this case, you're throwing money after the bad. So, Joyce, let me quickly read. A benefit that a person could have received but gave up. True. That is exactly what an opportunity cost is. So you're always looking at it that, all right, I could fix this using, I don't know, suppose $50,000 now. Or I could wait, and suddenly it's going to become a $300,000 issue. So you wait for that time, and let's talk about exactly how you'd calculate whether there's an opportunity cost of it or not. So suppose you could fix it in 2 weeks, or suppose it's a month, and it costs you, it would have cost you 50,000. You could fix it after a year and 1 month, which is now going to cost you $100,000. So your cost is going to go up by $50,000 in a span of 1 year. And the question is, could you have spent that extra $50,000 somewhere else, where you would have had a better return on investments? And the typical answer is yes, but not always. Here's the interesting catch, and that's what I'm not promoting a certain type of behavior, but I'm telling you how, to a certain degree, companies oftentimes use this opportunity costs to figure out exactly why they do certain things that they do. So, perfect example is, look at what Volkswagen did with its with cheating with its gas emissions. The reason it cheated on its gas emissions was because it realized that we can fix, so Volkswagen could fix the gas emissions at this point of time and incur a cost of possibly n number of dollars. Or it could fix it later at some other point of time and incur a huge cost otherwise. But Volkswagen oftentimes will think that, I don't know if this is what they thought, but oftentimes companies do that. That if we are to fix that cost right now, it might slow down our entire development schedule. Which means if we are to slow it down by 6 months, other companies might get into that space. We might lose very large government contracts or civilian contracts or whatever they are. And guess what? We are likely to lose. Altogether, we might end up losing $8 billion. Then they'll say that, all right, what happens if 5 years later or 3 years later, they find out that this was a negligent bit, or in this case, it would be a tort. Unless it creates harm, and then it becomes a felony. Then they'll say that, all right, there's a likelihood that the punitive damages and the compensatory damages will amount to $6 billion. The question is, should we let go of $8 billion worth of revenues right now? Or should we deal with $6 billion of incurring costs later on? Now, this is absolutely unscrupulous behavior, but it is behavior that companies practice all the time. And they look at their own setups and they try and figure out what road should we pursue in the face of competition and otherwise. Thank you. No, I'm just going to read it aloud because I think it's a very, very nice point you make. So totally agree. Another facet of this equation, sometimes it's more effective, less expensive to continue to operate with a problem, manual workarounds, and yes, it would be true in cases where alternative investments provide better ROI. Delay fixing, know the solution, and that exactly is the issue. So the question is, we're always trying to figure out what is the perfect hedge. And you've seen the same story go on with the mortgage markets. The question is, should I create a mortgage-backed security with loads of dicey loans in it and make 20 billion now? Or should I have very specific securities, well-marked bits, and lose all that bit, but then again, I might not be fined till it's 3 years later, where I'm going to be fined another 25 billion. So suppose the cost right now would have been 20 billion, right? And the costs later are going to be 25 billion. But as the actuaries would do is they would basically do a future value calculation in terms of, they say, all right, what is typically the rate of return? And assuming the rate of return is 4%, assume you're just putting out all your money into a Vanguard security, and which is a very, very safe security, and you say, all right, at 4%, if we were to put in that same $20 billion right now, will we be able to make more than 25 billion? Will that automatically become more than 25 billion in a span of 3 years when we are likely to get sued? And suppose at 4% rate of return, it turns out to be 27 billion or 25 billion. You would say, companies oftentimes become very unscrupulous and say, you know what, we're just going to go with it. So, true, Angela, absolutely. That elimination of any activity or material that doesn't... Yes, but think of it, right? The question is how you package what customers want, because, and that oftentimes is the story, right? That, all right, you're eliminating activities, materials that don't add value, but in the process, you're also trying to figure out, would elimination even cost me? Sometimes reworking has a cost. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be done. I'm mentioning that it's important for you to, especially when you're doing operational audit, that people sometimes don't do things not because they ought not to do it, but because they realize that the time value of money and the time value of an opportunity could be stacked either for them or against them. So they work themselves through, but you're absolutely right. So, and you'll see that going into Deming and Duran, this lean manufacturing was a mechanism of creating two things. First was transparency. You get things only when you need them. You build things only in small bits, which means your future cost of rework is dramatically reduced, mainly because you're creating it in small pieces. If those small pieces don't work, you just fix the small piece rather than fixing the huge bit that's been created. So Going back to it, workers are supposed to make decisions, not just the experts, and eliminate activities or materials that don't add value to a product. So, the next one is where are we there? So, as post-Deming period, of course, the Japanese philosophy and their sets became very interesting, but do realize it was not just quality, it was also going back into money and markets. If you ever hear anybody bemoan the fact that, oh, Japan always has a competitive edge against us, it's not just because Japanese goods have phenomenal quality, but there's something else to it. What Japan has done over time is in Japan industries, these are these big executives, they call the kairetsu. The kairetsus are always well tallied up. They're very, very chummy with the Bank of Japan. And the Bank of Japan always tries to enforce money supply so that the Japanese yen remains devalued. Now, if a currency is devalued, purchasing power of any other currency is always higher or always greater, which means it's always more lucrative to purchase from a country where their currency is weaker. And that's exactly what Japan does. So it's not just quality of products, it's also how they end up creating them, managing their money supply, so that typically you'll find that the Japanese yen, it floats around between 1 to 100 to $1 to $100 yen, or $1 to 105, 110 yen. That's also the way where they try to reduce those headwinds, and in this case provide you a better tailwind, which says, you know what, you want to make some good money in the United States, you can still price a Honda for whatever it is, I don't know, $30,000, but if you were to purchase a Honda from us, now because you've got a nice tailwind going, what you used to purchase a Honda for, I don't know, $18,000 or $16,000, you can now use the same dollar value, and basically dollar to yen conversion, you might find you're getting it at $16,000 or $15,000 rather than $18,000, which means it leaves a larger margin. It entices dealers and sellers and resellers to purchase more Hondas because you're working off the tailwind, but the tailwind coming from two bits. Firstly, good quality. Secondly, chumming up with the Bank of Japan to make sure that the currency stays nice and soft and mushy and devalued, making it always a much more interesting proposition for somebody else to purchase it. Make sense again, guys? Does that make sense? Generally? Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So now comes the 70s, the roaring 70s, and Harold Wilson's time, and Carter time, and into the 90s, where suddenly technology starts appearing, especially computing technology starts appearing, where the whole idea is, let's try and think of better routine automation of different things. So mainly focusing on machine movements, assembly lines, better control of setups, constant running, less wear and tear, getting less humans associated. They said that, all right, you want to reduce error rates. Human beings are fantastic at starting and thinking in very fuzzy sets. But human beings are not very good at repeating the same work over and over again and making fewer and fewer errors. The main reason is subconsciously most of us, except some accountants, are meant to get bored very quickly. And we tend to be bored a bit quickly. Oh, sorry, Noah, thank you for your comment. Right, so your comments, China is the elephant in the room. Interesting to see whether Trump actually pushes the agenda of labeling China as a currency manipulator, as we know they are, and you're absolutely right. So you'll see that, going back to it again, China has always been prompting itself as we are the place for investment, mainly for operational investment, because we guarantee you we're going to keep our currency in order. But keeping a currency in order is not the job of a country. The value of a currency ought to be determined by, or the determination is by the market. It's not, the determination is not to be done by a country, which therefore is fixing or manipulating. But here's the interesting thing. There are so many countries that work that manipulation schedule in order just by buying and selling of treasuries within their own country, that it's very difficult to ever really create that pressure. The only pressure comes from one of two things. The first thing, of course, is making sure that there's less emphasis in terms of importing from China. However, the way Western companies have already ventured and invested into the whole set, yes, true, and GDP numbers too. Thank you, Larry. We're so invested in China already. Breaking away from that whole set is going to require exactly what we're talking about right now. Is going to require the next generation of operational technology. If labor itself becomes a moot point, because technology itself solves most of these labor issues, can do all the things that labor can do. The question is, if it's technology, why do we worry about whether we are using the technology in the United States, because it's likely that the Western world is going to come up with the technology, versus whether we're using a certain technology in China or in Japan or anywhere else. And you'll see in the next couple of slides, I have a couple of links where you'll see some phenomenal bits in terms of technologies, and as we talk about it. So the idea of bringing in computers, whether you're talking about now CNC-based, whether you're talking about CAD-based specification design to production, a quick running, nowadays you're going into 3D printing, layout positioning, and so forth, as we talk about facilities and so forth. These become very, very important pieces of the puzzle. So you're doing material monitoring, you're doing just in time, you're doing continuous adjustments of settings, flow rates, and one quick bit, you can change a grip structure. You think of it, changing a human or training a human being to hold something and learn to move it in a certain way is very difficult. It's going to take hours of training with loads of error rates. Telling a machine hand to change it would change it dramatically too. So Larry mentioned, as you can spot it, that stealing ideas, making products less expensive due to their cost. Yes, and that's always been one of the biggest issues of IP protection. And then the question therefore becomes, the only reason IP is an issue is because you're sending your intellectual specifications to them to produce it. But the day you stop sending it to them, because the day you really start automating everything, becomes a very different story. However, as the brilliant chaps that you are, you also have to keep in mind the fact that if it affects labor in one place, it's going to affect labor in every place. Even American labor, English labor, the Scottish labor, Estonian labor, Italian labor, they're all going to suffer the same maladies, which is now it's no longer somebody else from another country or in another country taking up a job or taking your job. It's just the machines take your job. And the question is, where exactly does your flexibility lie to actually stop that, or to what extent do we to a certain degree, be able to, or are we able to retrain the workers? So manual to automation for reduction in process, increase output, less human error. Yes, true. The only thing is, I want you to also think a little bit beyond the box in terms of, all right, who is it going to impact? True, it's just a matter of time before the mad dash towards offshoring is going to change. But instead of offshoring, we're still going to do outsourcing. But who are we going to outsource it to? Will we now outsource it to machines? Will companies realize that why deal with compensation benefits and this cost and that cost, especially for routine jobs? If somebody is at an assembly line, if somebody's doing stamping, if somebody's doing fitting, if somebody's trying to fit a microcomputer inside a car at a very odd angle with a very weird reach, a human being is likely to create more human error and reduce output. But a machine can do that. So the question becomes, what happens to that person who was trained to do that in the process? And that becomes the next generation of thinking as we even venture. Because we can always say, oh, it's fine and dandy, anything that can increase output, reduce process costs or process issues, process non-value added matters, less human error is brilliant. But do we know of the transition that would define whether truly it's going to be a positive value added to society, or is society suddenly going to yell bloody murder? So I'll read this. Noah mentions that, so it sounds that what we're saying is to break the cycle and call it away from the set. The operations management discipline will become even more important and be raised to reduce expensive American-made goods. Our labor will remain more expensive even with the strongest stance with China, the world. So innovation within operations management is, and that is exactly what I'm saying. Understanding, this role, improving processes, robots. The question is, tomorrow you might be in the process of coming up with better logic for what a robot ought to do. What kind of processes can you automate? How would you automate them? How would you check for performance from that automation? What kind of innovations are you going to bring in that's going to change? And perhaps the next generation of workers are going to be people whose job is going to be even thinking of maintaining these robots, or even coming up with mechanism to deal with learning from these fuzzy human thinking and with streamlining processes. You're absolutely right. So it's not just that we'll stop outsourcing or offshoring. The question is, operations is always going to be reduce costs, increase efficiencies. Question is that going to be automatically by handing it over to workers who are American or British or German? Or is it actually going to be something in terms of handing it to somebody who's not going to carry all the baggage that a human worker carries with him or her? And that therein lies, and there isn't a real good answer. But if you can figure out of a way to even do workforce transitioning, as this comes into effect over time, including now, and going up to companies and saying that we're going to prepare your workforce for what is to come. It is to a certain degree a billion-dollar moneymaker for you. So going forward, the early 21st century, of course, it has been moving itself very well even in the 20th century. Enterprise systems have become a big piece of the puzzle, and enterprise systems are nothing but a single large database that carries all organizational information in it. So that enterprise system controls, coordinates every phase of production from initial customer orders. So the minute you place an order, it's automatically fed into the system. It checks and matches it with the inventory, looks at, in order to create that order, what goods do you have on hand, which facility stores those goods. If it's not at the immediate facility, it'll automatically send out a ping to the next facility saying, we need 3 items of this, 6 items of that, 9 items of this in order for us to start the assembly order. They will do an automatic scheduling, they'll do tooling requirements, run the schedules, track, do quality control monitoring, provide you constant dashboards and feedback across many different sets. Assembly, profitability, send out a shipping label, create a shipping label, reach out to FedEx or UPS and say, a package is going to be ready for you to be picked up at this point of time, and bill the customer accordingly, waiting for the invoice to be fulfilled as the package is being shipped out. And the whole idea is behind an enterprise system is, can we create a single snapshot of the industry, of the company, so that at any given point of time we can transparently figure out exactly what is going on, so that we are reducing bottlenecks from relaying information manually. But think of it, we're just talking about the same bit too. This whole idea of this ERP systems, yes, you're right, so it does enable transparency at every level of operation. Now, the information, oftentimes it's touted as real time, but real time information is both good and bad. Real time information can sometimes be overwhelming, because the question is, suppose you need to make a decision and say that, all right, we're going to set in these many orders. If you're really looking at purely real time itself is so enticing. We've actually found that if you really provide people real-time information, people tend to delay their decision making, because they think that real-time information is going to be their holy grail, and they can just wait a little bit more longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. That's going to give them perfect information. So oftentimes it's good to still create a deadline, and that's why companies will have moved from doing purely real time to doing periodic snapshot, where it gives you time to actually digest the information and then say, all right, this is what we found, this is what happened last hour. I'm going to get the next bit of information the next hour or so, or next 3 hours later, or 2 hours later, or 3 hours later, and I'm going to use that time to take a bit of a respite, breathe in, breathe out, and then make a decision. Otherwise, people tend to delay decisions when they think that more interesting and useful bits, so sometimes real-time information rather than automatically making it better for you in terms of making help you make quicker decisions, oftentimes can end up impeding your decision making. But you're very right, Angela. So if you are to look at it, and we're going to take a quick, a short break in about a couple of minutes or so. So get a chance, look at these very interesting bits. This whole idea. So going into operations, at least at warehouse and basic inventory level, works off three different things. The first one is called stowing, S-T-O-W, like stow. The small city or the small town we have out here. Stowing basically means storing. Second is picking, picking is basically knowing, I want this item, that item, and you've got a large bin from which you're picking certain things. And then there's sorting, which is you sort to make sure the right things belong to the right categories and the right places. And all of these get into a bin. So if you get a chance while we're taking a break, it's an absolutely, both of them are very, very interesting bits of videos. The very first one shows you, I've mentioned to you this company called Fanuc, which is a Japanese company that operates something called a lights out factory. So the company is called Fanuc, and it operates something called a lights out factory. And a lights out factory is nothing but a factory where no human being steps foot. Um, Everything is taken care of by robots, including they know when to fix their own robots before they start malfunctioning. Now, Fanuc is now getting into weird, very difficult sets. So, what you'll see in one of the first video, I think so, is you'll find that the, the robotic arm will take three small jars of pills of different colors and put them into the same and drop them into the same bin, which is nothing but a place where they're stowing it. And right after that, it'll use phenomenal speed to exactly pick out the right color pills and put them back separately, which is sorting. So it's a pick and sort. So it'll pick the right color pills and sort them into the right container from an open set of mixed colored pills. And when you look at it, you might find it very interesting and surprising at how good a machine is at recognizing colors to match and mix and pick and sort. The second one is actually called the KUKA robot, whose main focus is both picking, but picking in a different order. But its main idea is reflex-based control and how quick it is. So it goes up against a famous table tennis player, where it tries to return the ping pong balls back to the table tennis player. And you'll see how quick it is, which basically means at any given point of time, the robot is having to think where to place the paddle, the angle of the paddle, the expectation of where it's going to be returned, how fast to hit, whether to make a spin or not, and run the whole thing through. So you'll see that, and once we return, we'll talk more about robotics and opening up our various different bits. So guys, ready to take a quick break? Perfect, thank you. How about a 5-minute break, and then let's gather around right after that. Going forward, we're talking about so again, whether it's picking, sorting. I think we've once talked about if you ever get a chance to go to YouTube, or next time we're in class together, I might show that to you. The Amazon got this robot called Kiva, because it realized that it didn't want to waste the spaces between the shelving aisles. And instead of having people walk through aisles and getting stuck in there and two people can't pass each other, you can't reach up there, or you have a tough time finding where things are, what it did was it ended up with purchasing a company called Kiva, Kiva. So Amazon purchased Kiva, and it looks like a Roomba that sits under each of these shelves. And nowadays, the minute you place an order at Amazon.com, instead of a person going out and starting to pick and sort and do all that stuff to fulfill your order, a person at a terminal will simply, at the warehouse, will simply say order received, and the minute the order is received, the Kiva machines will be sent a ping, and each machine will know exactly what stuff it's carrying, and the machines will bring it to you. So you don't have to walk around the whole warehouse trying to pick pick and sort things. And suddenly, a process that typically took about 40 minutes can now be done in about 2 to 3 minutes. So it's become very, very, very quick. So whether we're talking about, so that's robotics in distribution. Then of course you have unmanned transportation, which is a huge area in its own right. And I've heard that Amazon's planning on doing its very first delivery in some place in one of the boroughs of London, in London or suburbs of London, to try out its drone delivery system. And that itself is going to be a very interesting piece of the puzzle. Plus, of course, the opening of these drones in civilian airspaces, and FAA, the Federal Aviation Authority, just opened up the drone space in for civil aviation, which basically means now you're going to suddenly see a lot of companies practice drones for more commercial purposes. Right now they're still mainly for cameras and surveying and basic detection. A lot of weird voyeurs planning on using them, but then you'll find companies that are doing it with a bit more gusto and a bit more purpose than the general set. So, quick historical summary, you can look at it, but we'll not get into every bit because we've covered the general set. Let's get into operation strategy. So, before we go into the tools and techniques, I'm using this as a prelude and a preface to why we end up using certain tools and strategies in terms of getting things done. So from Kellogg to Sony to Progressive Insurance, it really doesn't matter. Everybody uses operation strategy. A company like Kellogg uses operation strategy from very basic things, but these are very difficult things, which is once you create a cornflake and you want to coat that cornflake, you want to coat that cornflake evenly. And you've got these millions and millions of pieces of cornflakes. How do you make sure that next time you say, all right, it's going to have, I don't know, a blueberry flavor or a blueberry coating on it with bits of grains affixed to that coating? How do you make sure that the sides of all the cornflakes, both sides of of each cornflake, has that proper coating? How do you make sure that every time you're having one of those frosted flakes, which I absolutely adore, you're having one of those frosted flakes, you're basically being able to make sure that the frosting's there, the fruit's punched in, and everything. So whether it's Kellogg to whether it's Sony, who's coming up with a bunch of, I don't know, the next generation of Blu-ray 3Ds, making sure that layering's correct, and the burn rates are correct, and the quality is checked, and the labels are done, and the packaging's there, to creating the PlayStation and making sure that everything's running, to Progressive Insurance, where the minute you sign in and you provide your information, provide your car information internally, the idea is, can we get a human being out of this whole set? So if you think of Progressive, all they do is they have algorithms running it. So so here's how it would typically run. So a company like Progressive, it has two feeders. You're feeding Progressive your information, where you live, your age, your gender, how long you've been driving, your driving history, based on which it creates a separate snapshot just for you. That's your snapshot, regardless of the car that you're purchasing. Now you're providing it the car information by virtue of the VIN number. Once the VIN number gets in, Progressive will now look at the VIN number to understand, all right, what type of car is it? It'll now look at its own historical databases to say that, all right, the color of this car is red, the type of this car is, I don't know, an Alfa Romeo, the make and model, the engine type and everything. What exactly is the likelihood that a car like that is purchased by somebody who wants to speed? Now, if the answer is somewhat moderate because it's red in color, so anytime it's a red car, automatically the premium characteristic just based on the virtue of the car goes up. Then the system then matches it. And this is internal service operations that's taking care of it. Then now they'll say that what's the propensity of this driver to get into traffic tickets, accidents, traffic tickets based on what? What kind of violations? Combine these two things together, and suddenly you've got a single common profile that matches driver attributes with car attributes. And the minute it hits, so they've got very much like the gradations we have in taxes. They have these different gradations. Your credit history, along with your driving history, along with the type of car, the color of the car, and so forth, together will create a single, unique, custom profile just for you. If you fall in terms of one of the number categories, wherever your profile matches, they'll say, for this number profile, whether it's goes into various orders of risk, they'll have a different custom premium set just for you. And that's exactly how they do it. Does that make sense? Quick show of hands, or yes, or anything like that? Fantastic. Lovely. Thank you very much. Lovely. Thank you. So, so it doesn't really matter. Seriously, I really don't know. Possibly, I'm not very sure if it's the red car color is a myth or not, but I have seen color as an attribute in the calculation set. So, all right, cool, sweet. I really didn't know, honestly. So that's splendid to know. So the color itself might not really make sense. So yeah. So again, it depends, but the whole idea is typically, typically used to say that anytime it's a yellow car or a red car, there's automatically an internal historical flag. Now combine it with what that yellow car is, and it changes the structure. But I'm glad to know that it's no longer one of those things. And truly, and that's exactly going back into your operations planning, goes into it as a human being who, to a certain degree, finds these insightful analytical bits, and then is going to assign a weight to each of these things. And over time, if they say that, you know what, very cool. All right, thank you, Noah. So yes, so if they actually find that insight that colors aren't actually a reliable predictor of driving habits or cost of repairs, then the whole idea is colors will either have a zero weight, or else, if subtly over time they realize that, you know what, we tend to find that cars of a certain color tend to flock together. No, I'm joking. Tend to speed together. Then you might say, you know what, we typically did not assign a weight to it. Now we're going to assign a certain weight to it. So it's also something that's organic in nature, which means, and evolving in nature. It changes as you're now trying to figure out different ways of dealing with things, understanding things, coming up with charging the best premium while suffering the least consequences. So it doesn't matter where it is, but goes back into this whole idea that we now realize that we can feed the logic into a system, whether it's a robot or whether it's a general algorithm that's taking care of a certain decision. So you've got, so going back to it, you might have multiple plants in multiple countries for the manufacturers, different product mixes from local and imported ingredients for inventory, distribution, production, quality. You might have tangible products versus intangible service operations that require more experience, and you might say, all right, we want to say, for example, let me try and give you an example. Products are more likely, not always, but are more likely to have greater standardization. But nowadays, previously they always used to say, oh, quality is only measured at a product level. Now what they're saying is, we want to measure quality as a user experience level, which is not just at the building of the product level, but how somebody ends up using the product over time to create a single 360-degree view of what user experience is. A perfect example is the product might have brilliant quality, but just installing the product is such a tedious and a tenuous and oftentimes such a cumbersome process that even with the best product, customer experiences are absolutely horrid. The question is, will you still call your product a quality product, given the fact that at the end of the day, the user experience, the total user experience, because of your operational set, but this is an operational story, it's important for you to know exactly where to put in something to fix. For example, a few months ago, I purchased one of those thermostats called a Nest. If you've heard of the Nest thermostat, but it's supposed to be one of those Internet of Things thingies. And I wanted to just replace it just by myself, and I opened my previous thermostat and took a picture of all where the wires go in, what color wires, and what the markers are for W and C and B and all that stuff. And then I started putting things into the Nest wiring setup, only to realize that, wait, why is it that the fan's churning out cold air when I'm asking it to churn out warm air? And it took me a call, but it was quickly fixed. But here was the thing. What was previously marked on my thermostat as a wire that was going into something called B1 was meant to be the same wiring that went into C for the Nest thermostat. Now, did I end up finding it? Yes, because there was a tiny small bit on the Nest website itself. While I was talking to the person, I was also searching on the website. And I found it there, but it was in tiny letters. But at one point of time when it didn't work, and I'd spent about 10-12 minutes talking to the person, who was a very nice person, but couldn't really figure out exactly what happened. And I had to even send her the picture of the previous wiring and the new wiring. I took a picture of both with my phone. And I thought, I don't think I really want to have it, because I know it's a very cool product and it's a good energy saver and all that stuff, but I think I'm just going to pack it and just return it back to Home Depot till I got to solve it. But had I not been able to solve it? So this is an example of where a product itself, measuring the quality of a product, and since then it's been working beautifully. But the measuring a product itself is a function of how operationally well it's been created, not just for the functioning of the product, but also for things such as installations, for changing things. So for example, if I want to turn the fan on for 15 minutes and stop it if I'm somewhere away and I want to tweak up the temperature, lower the temperature, I should be able to do that without a hitch, or without any hitches or any kind of glitches. If it doesn't work that way, For me, it's one more cost. One more cost basically means it's an operational failure. Because when you're building the whole set, you weren't thinking of it in terms of the customer experience. You were thinking of it mainly as, is the engineer happy with it? And truly, the engineer could be absolutely gleeful because he or she might have seen that thing so many times and say, oh, right, if it's not going into B, it just got to go into C. That's the next alphabet up that line. But not, but it's difficult to sometimes, so it's very important when we do modeling called House of Quality. You'll see why it's important to match customer behavior with your operations design to actually create an operational strategy. Does that make sense? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Everybody else too? Hetal, Jackie, everyone? Thank you. Jackie, everything all right? You're there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
Sorry.
cool. No worries. So yeah, so no, so with operation strategy in mind, how do you position the workforce jobs that don't quite exist yet? Have you seen effective strategies to bridge the future, or always it would be a riff exercise, right? So you're going to play it by the ears sometime, but to a certain degree. The question is, so there is it's not an easy answer, but there is an answer or there's some response to it. The response set is, what companies therefore are doing with their operations is they're revisiting their processes. So as we talked about it, that a lot of operations starts with knowing your operational processes and knowing where the value added and the non-value added costs are and where opportunities lie. So companies are trying to stay abreast of emerging technologies in terms of, are there certain analytical algorithms that are coming through the pipeline? Are there certain robotic setups that are coming through the pipeline? If that's coming through the pipeline, let's look at where we get the highest rate of return from each of our processes. Let's look at the processes where we're not getting ample returns. Let's look at each of these processes and find out what the error rate is for every single input to output setup. If you know that the error rates are high, you're always keeping in mind. You've asked your operations manager, you asked your whether it's a COO or whatever, or the COOs asked you that. Keep that in mind, and as you're scanning the environment to see new products and so forth, you can say that, all right, this is coming into play, which is talking about reducing error rates, which basically means if I were to use, my next bit might be to reduce error rates and increase efficiency, because that's giving me the lowest process margin on return, or a return margin. So I'm going to install that. This is going to be an impact assessment. It's called the term itself is called an impact assessment. So the impact assessment will look at what will we change, what's going to be impacted by it, and it's not just human beings, but it's also going to be other processes, other divisions, and so forth. And you look at what exactly is the impact criteria. Now, going back to workforce jobs, if you know what this impact criteria is, now you start screening the people who are holding those jobs and say that who are the better performers, who are not very good performers, because that also becomes a quick and dirty way to make sure that, all right, if we're changing something, we'd rather kill multiple birds with the same stone. We're going to let some people go. But the thing is, are there some people with very good return, with great return potential? Could we now move them into some other group or cross-train them? And then that's the time when companies oftentimes say that, you know what, we're just instituting something called the leadership center, or a leadership training, or flexible workforce training. I would love to call it something called a flexible workforce training. And you would start picking, or because of your previous vetting, screening, and moving these people into sets where you know that they might be very good. Once this technology, this algorithm comes into play, they might be good at working with it because they still offer great returns on investment, but maybe their job's going to go the way of the dodo. I don't know if I responded properly to your very, very sharp question, Noah, but at least that's my attempt at it. Noah, okay, cool. So thank you. So yes, true. There is a tendency to take the savings, and that's always the key. The question is, where do you want the savings? From whom do you want the savings? And how do you end up attributing the ones that you still think are pertinent, mission critical, resource critical, and plan them so that when things come, you're subtly not sort of scurrying to find a quick set of sort of off the hat solutions or off the wall solutions in the process. So true, in general, because the tenured workers are skilled but expensive, and the question is that a skill that you would like to still maintain? Or is that skill something that is replaceable by some other form of automation, or simply divvying up the processes, or whatever it is? So just because a certain worker is killed doesn't automatically mean, it's the very famous theory, I have to go back to it, remember in Seinfeld, George Costanza was brilliantly cast, what's his name? Jason Alexander as George Costanza. He was very skilled, very tenured, very expensive. But guess what? The minute Seinfeld ends, George Costanza, or Jason Alexander, has had a terrible time finding another decent bit of employment, mainly because he's so skilled, so tenured, but only to be George Costanza and nothing else. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but that's one analogy. That just because somebody is very skilled at something doesn't automatically mean that he or she is likely to always rule the roost. The question is, sometimes it's so difficult to even set them up. Right? You do get pigeonholed. And you'll see that happen so many times. And oftentimes you'll see that people who've worked for companies that are let go is because they were wonderful at what they did, but it was very difficult to ever place them somewhere else. So going back to its flexibility thing, and just because they're skilled doesn't automatically mean that they are going to be a high resource. And that's why skilled with a chance where there's a chance of automation, skilled and expensive where there's a chance of automation, that's even quicker to go down the tube of sorts. So they're quicker to go extinct. So one last thought. Don't want to belabor the point. All right, fair enough. You've seen me. I do believe that if we're getting at something, let's understand it from various facets. The financial services industry, transaction handling is becoming less valuable. Problem solving, complex exception handling. That's very, very true. We remain in the mix till AI, cognitive computing, robots take over. But true. Here's the interesting thing, and it goes back to, so transaction handling is basically just making sure that things match, the billings are done. If something is sent out, whether it's an information transaction or even a physical transaction, you're trying to sort of automate it. Problem solving and complex exception handling will always be tricky, mainly because the The brilliance of human beings lies in our ability to ask questions. AI still can't ask questions, and it'll take possibly eons for AI to even, cognitive computing right now is it's interesting, but cognition is only in terms of do you learn or can you learn. Never can you ask a question. So cognitive computing, let me give you an example and will I think that will be a nice bit to move forward. A cognitive computing example would be, suppose you were to choose a route on your car's GPS to go to your house, and you start driving from your university to go to your house, or from your office to go back to your house, and the car has specific parameters or specific options that says fastest routes with highways, without highways, this and that, and you choose one and it automatically fits that in. However, you start driving the car and you take a turn that the car didn't want you to take, and you take another shortcut till you arrive at your house. So the car maintains a quick log of it, or the system in your car would maintain a quick log of it. And this is assume the car has cognitive computing. And it'll say, all right, ask me to go from work to the house, took a shorter time, had less fuel costs, because it can also understand your, if it's truly a smart car, it can understand how much fuel consumption you've had. So, but says, all right, I don't know if this is an exception or if it is something that actually makes proper sense. So, what it'll then do is it'll say, all right, I'm going to log it. Next time you ask another GPS set, it'll again set up the original GPS set and see whether you're following it again. The minute you've followed it and you've been able to make a successful follow through, it'll now say what was an exception is now a pattern. And I'm going to put that pattern as a new route option, which is user-defined route. So now this time you want to go from work to your house, it'll ask you want to take the highway or do you want to take your user-defined route? And that takes... Sorry, Hital, please go ahead.
Oh, it was an accident. Sorry.
Oh, it was by accident. No worries. Always a pleasure. So yes, so going back to the fact, you're very right. But the beauty of human beings is being able to ask that question in terms of, the very thing we started off with when we were talking about money and markets is, should we create an operational decision-making criteria where we can come up with spot trades and future trade decisions in order for us to build on currency tailwinds and currency headwinds to reduce our operational costs? But that's a question you ask. Now, the system will be able to solve it for you very quickly because they can now look at currency exchanges and currency moves every 5 seconds, which we wouldn't have the attention span to do so. But the question is what drives the decision. It's not the response set that comes off it that's ever going to take over. Does that make sense? All right, cool. Sweet. Thank you very much, Noah. A very, very good question. Thank you very much. So, our next piece of the puzzle is understanding competitive priorities and capabilities. Competitive priorities would be rank order what you want to achieve. So that's exactly what we are talking about. Remember, we were talking about how Progressive might be making a decision on what kind of premium to charge to a certain thing, or for a certain thing. So they might have a ranked order in terms of, this one is an important attribute for us to understand whether there's a risk, there's a driver's risk or a car level risk. If that is a very important attribute, it's ranked higher. Anything that's ranked higher is likely to have a higher weight assigned to it. But for example, as you mentioned that if it's something such as colors are no longer important, the rank order of color in making a competitive priority is going to be largely lower. And that's very important. So, but the question is, how would you create and calculate it? And when we're in class, will try out a few different mechanisms of understanding different ways of tackling these issues in terms of how would you weigh things. And plus, you'll see this competitive priorities and capabilities when we do House of Quality, which is the total production system. So competitive capabilities would be ability of existing resources to match certain achievements. And the thing is, how would you calculate it? So your whole basis is, going back to what Noah is that how do you prepare your workforce? How do you do workforce transitioning for something that is yet to happen or yet to come? And that's your idea of resource allocation, because a huge part of operational excellence is knowing which resource to use for what purpose, including your own company. You might even ask yourself this question, that you, as the brilliant resource that you are, does my company allocate me for the right job? Because that is a competitive capability. If the resource is not being allocated, if you as a resource, you're not being allocated for exactly where you'd provide the highest return on investment, the company is making a dreadful decision of sorts. And of course, you have to ensure that from time to time, just the way you would do that with the people you manage, in terms of this person, regardless of where he or she is working now, is that where I'm going to get the best return from allocating that employee? And that's when you start looking at something called a gap. So the gap analysis is nothing but analyzing what you expect versus what is actual. So you look at what your priorities are. This is my expectation from this person, from this certain resource, from this asset. This is what I'm actually getting. Is it surpassing my expectations, or is it falling short? If it's falling short, why? Is it falling short mainly because it's not very good at it, or have I allocated the resource into the wrong container? Two pieces. Don't always act on in your operations planning that any resource is not performing very well because that, whether that's research, whether it's tangible, intangible, human being, a certain machine is, or a facility, is because it's just not the right thing, or whether is it the right thing for the right job that I've assigned to it. And that's oftentimes important, because many times I have solved problems. I went to a place that makes donuts, and they were planning to move into a completely new warehouse because they wanted to create one more line, while they could have created another line within that same setup itself just by rearranging the facilities. So suddenly, where you even manage your flow, where you maintain certain personnel within, or the staffing, or your line workers, how the line workers are sitting, what kind of work they're doing, at what point of time are they converging. Those all come into play. So it's resource allocation as well as return on investment on that resource. So is the resource good or bad? Might be that the resource was just a dreadful mistake. So that's a different story. You get rid of it. On the other hand, the resource might just be misallocated. And understanding misallocation of resources and solving the misallocation is possibly one of the key things that you could do, which goes back to Noah's very good point in terms of the problem solving and complex exception handling process that you could bring to the table. Going forward, operational strategies and priorities, operations strategy and competitive priorities and capabilities. So your main competitive priorities, and this is from a general text, says, and it's a good set. Your competitive priorities are costs. You want to constantly lower your costs. And once again, just mentioning it ad nauseum, even if you don't have much room to play around with pricing and therefore your revenues, you're much more in control of your processes and the costs associated with them. So you're always trying to put downward pressure on costs. And low-cost operations automatically will reduce two things: both the fixed cost distribution per unit, because you're bringing general structures down, plus of course the variable costs per unit. Therefore, if your variable costs go down per unit, and even if you really can't manage your fixed costs very well, still, guess what? Your break-even point drops too, which means you can now make a better profit by selling fewer products even at the same price point. The second one is quality, and you want to maintain consistent quality, which the reason why we talked about Deming and Duran and so forth. And you also want to have superior quality. So consistency is key. If I were to ask you, how, now that you're already brilliant, now that you're getting your MBAs, how would you ever measure consistency? Quick tryouts. If you could just type half a sentence or so about it, how would you go about? Very good. Control points is one. What else? But what would you measure there? You would know that there are control points where you ought to measure, but how would you know if something is consistent or not? Anybody? Beautiful. All right, getting same output. So when you all right, sustainability, all right, fair enough. But how would you measure it? The answer is yes, true, metrics. But the measurement piece is you have to mention it in terms of variance or standard deviation. If it's a random set, you know that you're not consistent. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. So the question is, true, you can have, and it's very important to have a baseline, very important to have the control points, but as all of you mentioned very nicely too, you have to look at that deviation. The tighter the deviation, or the smaller the deviation, and the tighter it is, you know that you're consistent. Even if you have problems and you're consistent with your problems, it's a good sign rather than not having problems but you're inconsistent. Some periods you're brilliant, some periods you're horrid, some periods you're doing a fantastic, or your labor or your line workers or your employees or your team's doing a great work. Next one they're not. The first thing, do take this away as one of the most important things you'll learn, which is make sure you're constantly looking at deviation from your standard, and your standard is your baseline. So you can create your baseline. I want people to be working at this level. Now I want to see how much they're deviating from that set. So it's very, very important for you to figure that out. And the second one, okay, let's see, Larry, one thing to keep in mind is that if you lower your cost due to changing or lower materials costs, you should at least be aware of what effect there would be if you're sure that you do not run into product failures due to out of spec. You're absolutely right. And this is another very important thing that Larry mentioned. So that's why two things you need to follow. Two things to follow when cost when practicing cost control. Practicing cost control. The first is pilot it first to crease out. First to crease out the wrinkles. The second is phase it in incrementally rather than radically. So you have to follow these two things. So that's a very, very, companies that jump sort of headlong or fall headlong into certain bit, you're not understanding the ramifications of your decision. So first, two general things, you can follow many other things, but pilot it. So choose a small bit of operations where you're trying it out and working it through, because you'll find that there are always going to be some weird idiosyncrasies that you have to crease out. And the second bit is always phase it in slowly. And when you're phasing it in, transition so that you have things in parallel till new operations are obvious. Operations are obvious. So that also allows you to move into learning curve issues, because do realize it takes companies to even institute a learning curve, and there's always going to be a productivity dip the minute you institute something absolutely brand new. So it's very, very important. So I think these are some of the things that's very useful to keep in mind. And the second one, of course, so consistency is one, and the second one is superior quality. Okay, so let's look at, so now that makes sense. Embracing a test and learn pilot approach. We talk a lot about that at work. The sort of pattern of results is important as well. For example, a prolonged sawtooth pattern, up down could signal the process out of control, regardless of the amount of standard. Well, Noah, I agree with you, but not completely. The standard deviation is going to be key, because you'll never ever have a perfectly straight line in terms of a pattern, because that would just be a time of miracles. You're always going to have some bumps left and right, but the question is, how are that amount of standard deviation, is that a tolerable standard deviation? Because you'll always have standard deviation, doesn't matter. And that therein lies this whole idea of, well, are you having standard deviations with under a 6 sigma set, which would be your sawtooth only moves by about 4 out of a million, which is extremely tolerable because it's very little deviation. So every time you think of, you've heard of 6 sigma too many times possibly. And that's exactly what 6 sigma does. It tries to tighten the noose around the amount of deviation you have so that it's controllable. So let's see. So Larry says, so yes, so going back to Noah, and then I'll try to tackle Larry. It's important to understand that you'll always have some degree of standard deviation. And if you actually have a proper sawtooth pattern, it's not bad, because if you look at your standard deviation, there's something called heteroscedasticity. There's a pattern set, you know exactly what to solve. However, if you just have big jumps somewhere and small jumps somewhere, then it's a bigger problem because you really don't know where to solve it. And Larry says, I've seen material changes or reductions be fine at first, but a change by the vendor due to labor issues cost large sums to correct unless you have a parallel backup or alternative plan in place that can kick in until a correction is made. And that's the reason why I mentioned make sure you have some kind of parallel transitioning so that you're giving somebody a chance to sort of get used to the change and know how to manage that change before you simply constitute or shove the change down somebody's throat. And that is a very good point. So both Noah's point, Larry's points is very right. Look at patterns, but do realize that there's always a tolerable band. What the tolerable band is going to be dependent upon you making the decision and how you're going to handle the exceptions. And the other thing is, as Larry mentions, that try and make sure that you're running things, you're phasing things in. So there's a mechanism of a shadow set running till something else happens. A perfect example is look at Brexit. Or even look at the presidential transitioning. Why is it that election happens or results are out and you know who's the president-elect in November, but the actual transfer of power happened yesterday? It gives everybody a chance. Why is it not that the next day after election everybody says, all right, we know the president is bye Barack Obama, welcome Donald Trump? Because things are going to be absolutely chaotic. This is phased transitioning. And you start up with this phased transitioning where you're choosing a cabinet and doing all these things, but you're letting everybody breathe a bit. Just like Brexit and invoking Article 50 is going to take a couple of years before things actually move forward. It's already been about 8 months anyway. So, by the way, we'll stop here. Absolutely splendid time. I think this should be a recorded set that will be sent out to you. I'm not very sure, so I'm going to give it a shot. But just the way I mentioned it, I did a parallel thing where I'm also recording the same bit on my iPad. So if I cock it up on the collaborate end, I'm going to try and make sure that you at least have this bit ready.